If you recall, we have the supplemental book that's available for free through the library on the website. Just go to eBooks. And we're going to look at Chapter 4. This is a really good introduction to jQuery. Your textbook has a couple of chapters on it, which aren't bad, but I think the narrative in this book is a little bit better. So let's look at jQuery. And their motto is write less, do more. Very cool. jQuery is a JavaScript library. And all a library is a collection of code that provides simple solutions to many of the mundane day-to-day details of JavaScript. In other words, it's excellent because we want to be a little bit more productive. And one of some of the advantages of jQuery is small file size. It's friendly to web developers. Everybody uses it and pounds on it. It's pretty well tested. It's free. By the way, it's free. By the way, did I say it's free? That's really good. Large developer community and lots of plugins that people contributed. If you've got a problem, you can just about be assured if you Google jQuery and your JavaScript problem, somebody's written a plugin for it. There are other libraries out there. Some of them, like Yahoo and MooTools and Prototype, are fairly popular, but jQuery is the king of the hill as far as popularity goes. Now, how do you get jQuery? Well, I'm glad you asked. And how do you load web pages with jQuery? Another thing that's really cool to ask. Well, when you get it, you want to just link to it in your document using the code at the top. You're hosting it, you're responsible for it, but you have the file and you have control over it. The 1.71 in this instance is the version number, and the minimum just means it's been compressed a little bit to make it take less time to download. There are places out there like Google and Yahoo and Microsoft that will host it for you. jQuery is that popular. These content delivery networks will download it for everybody. The advantage of that is if somebody goes to a website that downloaded jQuery from Google and you do the same thing, it's already cached and on their machine. There's no time lag whatsoever. It's instantly available. And even if they don't have it already, the way web downloads work is if you let Google host it, then it will download in parallel or asynchronously to all the other stuff on your page. Very, very nice. It saves time. The only problem is if you are away from the internet and authoring or testing or doing whatever and you don't have jQuery and you're trying to host it on Google or letting Google host it, you're kind of stuck. But we all have, or at least internet access is fairly common nowadays, so don't have to worry about that as much. Let's go see how to get jQuery. Here we are at the jQuery site. Nice big download button. There's a lot of good tutorials on this site, but for right now let's just download jQuery. So I click on it and I get the code for jQuery. Depending on which browser you have, it might ask you to download it right away. In Firefox, at least on the Mac, it just gives me, hey, there's jQuery. So if I got to go up to File and say Save Page As, and I'll save it to my desktop. I already saved it before, but I could save it to my desktop and you would have it. So again, if you have time, take a little time to look through this website, become familiar with all the different tutorials and documentation available. Come in really, really handy. One other last thing before we leave for right now, there's a development version of jQuery. Notice it's a lot bigger because it's uncompressed and a little bit easier to read. And if you want to know how jQuery works, it is just straight JavaScript. If you spend enough time, you could understand it and maybe even contribute back to the project, which is always cool. So, we link to jQuery in our document with a script tag, source equals, just like any JavaScript that you're pulling in that you've authored. And then you use the jQuery ready function versus the normal window load function we've been using so far. I'll go into this a bit more in a minute, but basically jQuery is a little bit smarter about how it works. It doesn't wait till everything loads on the page, all the images and all the links and everything. It waits till the DOM is loaded and all the um, tags are loaded, and then it goes right ahead and does its thing. It lets your code run before all the images are downloaded, but the DOM is ready. It's really, really pretty cool. Instead of window.onload, we're going to use the document.ready. Now, the link to the jQuery file has got to be before everything else. You can't use jQuery properties and methods before jQuery loads. That makes a lot of sense. So you put your JavaScript programming after any CSS style sheets. That makes sense because you have to, if you want to manipulate styles, the JavaScript has to come after the style sheets. And because jQuery programming often references those styles, make sure it's after everything is loaded. And a good rule of thumb is to put your JavaScript programming, all the script tags, after any other content inside the head tag, but before the closing head tag. And a lot of people will put the links to their programming, their JavaScript programming, at the very end before the closing body tag. That's another technique a lot of people use. One thing you can do to keep things organized is to add a comment after your function, your document.ready function, just to keep things organized as your code gets longer and longer. So, jQuery provides a shortcut method for writing this big honking document load, what we call the document load function. They call it the document.ready function. And the shortcut is just what you see there, the $sign with the function with the curly braces, and your programming goes there. We're going to talk about this more and what it means at another time, but for right now, instead of window.load, you want to use this document.ready function, either the long form or the short form, until you get used to it. I'd use the long one. It doesn't really matter. What jQuery does in your document is, everybody's used mapping software on their computer. Instead of having to refresh the page, one of the cool things that a library like jQuery and JavaScript will let you do is pre-cache and preload a lot of the functionality of the map, so you aren't waiting every time you click a left or a right or trying to go up or down, north or south on a map. It will keep the page from refreshing. It just goes out to the server and says, hey, what's the next thing? And doesn't try and redraw the whole page. Or for instance, here on the Netflix site, they have some pop-up windows. All that's done with jQuery. And just be aware, kind of look and watch all the different interactivity, all the different behaviors that are done either strictly with JavaScript or more than likely with a library like jQuery on these pages. It's amazing how much stuff is done. Another very, very common thing is, say, just a pop-up calendar. Done with jQuery. In fact, it's so common, there's a special plugin called the jQuery UI project that includes this functionality. So how all this works? Well, you select an element on a page, then you do something. Not terribly difficult. Now you can change a property of an element, you can add new content, you can remove an element, you can extract information from the element, all the normal stuff that you would think, like adding and removing a class attribute, etc., etc., etc. It all works because of the DOM. We're just going to beat the DOM to death this term. Take a simple web page like this. You've seen something like this before. Body with the H1 and a paragraph tag. You break it out into its nodes. We have elements and attributes and text nodes. Nothing you haven't seen before. To address these with just plain old JavaScript, you have to use the proper DOM syntax. You can start with the document root object and say document.getElement by ID or document.getElements by tag name, or the less well supported but perfectly fine from a standard standpoint, getElements by class name. And you can use any of those to select the objects on the web page you want to manipulate. Oh man, the problem with the DOM is especially IE, browsers have not treated or thought of the DOM the same way. In fact, Microsoft had an entirely different way of looking at the DOM for a long time. Version 9, if you have Windows 7, IE9 is really pretty good, and 10 is supposed to be absolutely great at following DOM standards. Problem is, a lot of people have Windows XP still, and a lot of people are still using older versions of Internet Explorer. So the nice thing is jQuery lets you get around all this by standardizing the selection and the manipulation of elements. It doesn't care, it doesn't matter which browser you're using, and you don't have to code all the exceptions, which is a pain to code out all the exceptions for IE. There are books, really boring books, written just on that subject. So we aren't going to spend a lot of time on those kinds of exceptions, but as you get into JavaScript, you're going to have to breach that subject. jQuery lets you get around it in a lot of instances. So, how do you make selections in jQuery? What is behind door number 2? Well, it's not that bad. $ is the shortcut or the abbreviation instead of using the word jQuery, because we as programmers are naturally lazy. Just go ahead and admit it. We're lazy creatures. We don't like to type. I hate to type. And you could either type out the word jQuery or you can use the $. And to make a selection, you put it inside the parentheses, inside some quote marks. Doesn't matter if it's single or double quotes. And you use CSS syntax that you are very familiar with to make selections. You don't have to go through all the different DOM elements to pick and choose what you want. You just use a CSS selector. It's very, 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 very cool. So, if you have some HTML, get a paragraph with an ID of copyright, and through the DOM, you'd have to say document.getElementById, then copyright. With jQuery, you just say, hey, just like in CSS, pound or hash mark, copyright. Very, very, very cool. Now, let's go out and look at a file that's included with that supplementary text. One of the first pages of it talks about downloading some files, and you can go grab this if you're interested. It talks about some different selectors. So here is one of the selectors exercise files. It's included with that book. And what it does is it lets you type in jQuery selections. And if you've had any SQL or any other kind of database training, you know, half the fun of anything is just learning how to select things. So let's type in a selector here in this box. And query just means selecting. So jQuery, JavaScript query, or JavaScript selections. So let's type in, as they suggest, class of column 2 and hit apply and see what it selects. It selects column 2 over there. That's pretty cool. So I'm going to change that to a class of column 1 and hit apply. Column 1 is highlighted. Interesting. You can also go down here and hit some sample selectors. If I hit, let's say text, all the text nodes, there's just one in that form. All the first paragraphs, interesting. Everything that's in the main, wow, class of main is all of that. All the paragraphs right there. One little side note you may or may not remember, the asterisk is the universal selector for selecting everything. It's rather processor intensive. I kind of stay away from it in general. But it's kind of fun every now and then to select everything. Lots of different CSS selectors down here you can play with or type in. I wonder what would happen. Let's try a div tag and apply all the divs. Wow, lots of divs there. So that is basically something you can play around with and learn the different selectors.